Hello, boys and girls. It's so great to see you again. Welcome to another Story Hour with Ms. Garner. Today, I'm so excited to be able to share with you one of my favorite genres of literature, fairy tales. And today, we're going to be listening to a fairy tale that was written by the Brothers Grimm. Well, actually collected, I should say, and we'll talk more about that later. There are many fairy tale writers. Hans Christian Andersen is one. He wrote The Little Mermaid. You might remember that one. And also The Steadfast Tin Soldier. But today we're going to be talking about the Brothers Grimm. And they were brothers, just like their name says. This is a book titled Who Were the Brothers Grimm? And I'm just showing it to you today in case you want to read more about them. These who were or who was books, they're great, great biographies. So hopefully if you want to research them more, you can find that book. Also, the internet has a lot of information about the Grimm brothers. Speaking of the Grimm brothers and fairy tales, I wanted to quickly show you one of my favorite books. You can tell it's a little worn. I've had it for a long time, but this is a collection of Grimm fairy tales. And I have read this book many, many times and have enjoyed every single fairy tale in this book. The Grimm brothers have written fairy tales that you might be familiar with. How many of you have read Hansel and Gretel? Does that sound familiar to you? Okay. And how about Rapunzel? Okay, yes. Now, both of these books, in addition to many others, were collected by the Grimm brothers. So let's find out a little bit more about the Grimm brothers. Who were they? Well, their names were Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. They were born in Hanau, Germany. Jacob was born on January 4th in the year 1785 and passed away in the year 1863 at the age of 78. Wilhelm, his brother, was born February 24th in the year 1786 and died in 1859 at the age of 73. They came from a large family, a family of 9 children, and growing up they had a comfortable life in a middle-class family. However, their life did become difficult when their father unfortunately died of pneumonia when they were ages 11 and 10. And at that time, the boys had to assume adult responsibilities and help out with the family. Remember, there were many children in the family. So they did that and helped out, and eventually were able to attend the University of Marburg. And they took classes in law and poetry. They thought they wanted to become lawyers, boys and girls. That's what they originally wanted to do. But they started to lean more toward pursuing literary research. And they were inspired and motivated by a man named Clement Bretano, who was a poet. And their enthusiasm for folk poetry grew, and they decided, this is the direction we want to go in, both of them. So one of their tasks was to begin collecting folk tales. And as you might know, boys and girls, folk tales are stories that are handed down from one generation to another. Perhaps you know some folk tales. Maybe your grandparents have shared some stories, or maybe your parents have shared stories with you that they heard when they were a child, maybe from their grandparents or great-grandparents. So in our culture, we have stories that we pass down from one generation to another. So the Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm decided to begin collecting these stories. And they would interview people, and different people would share the stories that they knew and grew up with, and they began writing them down until they had quite the collection. One thing that they noticed, and that you'll notice too as you read fairy tales, is that good always triumphed over evil. And maybe that's why I enjoyed reading fairy tales so much. I liked the happy endings. I liked the way that good always won in the end. So they began to collect them, and some of the fairy tales that they collected, you might have heard of. Little Red Riding Hood, that was collected by the Grimm brothers. Snow White, does that sound familiar? How about Sleeping Beauty? And one of my favorites, Rumpelstiltskin. And then later, Rapunzel, Hansel and Gretel, we already mentioned Cinderella, and many more boys and girls. There are a lot, as you can tell by looking at this collection. I even have a bigger book that has even more. Some people claim, boys and girls, I thought this was an interesting fact, that their collection of fairy tales has only been outsold by 2 other books. Which 2 books do you think are more popular than Grimm's fairy tales that have sold more copies? Can you think of a book that probably has sold more copies than any other book in the world? Did any of you say the Bible? Because if you did, you're correct. So yes, some claim that their collection has only been outsold by the Bible and Shakespeare. They're in pretty good company, I'd say. We talked about both of the brothers attending university. So they were actually university-trained philologists. What is philology? It's the study of language and historical text. And they were also librarians at one time. They, not only were they librarians, but they were also writers. They wrote books about mythology and published scholarly works on linguistics and medieval studies. They were quite intelligent. They were working on, right before they passed away, boys and girls, they were actually working on a German dictionary. And sad to say, they died before the dictionary was finished. They only reached the letter F. But even though they did not finish their German dictionary, they collected and had published so many fairy tales, boys and girls, for all of us to enjoy. And so we're grateful to them for that. They were amazing, amazing men. Fairy tales. What do you know about fairy tales? That's right, they're make-believe. Do you know the elements of a fairy tale? Well, children in my class have a list of elements, and as they listen to the fairy tale today, they're going to hopefully have their list nearby, and they can listen for elements that are in the fairy tale that they have in front of them. So some of those elements are, you can tell a story is a fairy tale by these characteristics. Fairy tales begin with once upon a time, or there was once, or there once was, or long ago, or a long time ago. That's how fairy tales usually begin. So if it starts that way, it's a good chance it's a fairy tale. Also, in fairy tales, there are good characters and bad or evil characters. There's also an element of royalty, princes or kings, queens, castles. And of course, my favorite thing, there's make-believe or magic in fairy tales. In fairy tales, you'll find that sometimes characters are mistreated. There are mistreated characters. And also one thing that's fun to discover, in many fairy tales, things tend to happen in threes, in groups of 3. Fairy tales have a theme where they teach a lesson. We talked about the theme being that good overcomes evil. And if there are any animals in fairy tales, they take on human characteristics in the sense that they can talk. And my most favorite thing about fairy tales is that fairy tales have happy endings. So boys and girls, I hope that you enjoy the fairy tale that I selected today. And hopefully we'll have a chance before the school year is over to read lots more. This summer, boys and girls, I hope you'll be able to discover more fairy tales on your own. There are so many. It would take a whole summer to read them all, maybe even more. The fairy tale that I'm going to read to you today, boys and girls, is titled Rumpelstiltskin. And this has been retold and illustrated by a wonderful illustrator, Paul Zelinsky. Oh my goodness, I could look at his artwork forever. I think his artwork is worthy of the most, oh my gosh, the most magnificent museum. Museum worthy for sure. So we'll start with this first picture. I wouldn't mind having that picture framed in my house. It's so beautiful. Rumpelstiltskin. In all my years of teaching, I have never taught anyone with that name. I wonder if they call him Rumpel for short. From the German of the Brothers Grimm. Once there was a poor miller who had a beautiful daughter. On his way to town one day, the miller encountered the king. Wanting to impress him, the miller said, "I have a daughter who knows the art of spinning straw into gold." Now the king had a passion for gold, and such an art intrigued him, so he ordered the miller to send his daughter to the castle straight away. When the girl was brought before him, the king led her to a room that was filled with straw. He gave her spools and a spinning wheel and said, "You may spin all night, but if you have not spun this straw into gold by morning, you will have to die." With that, he locked the door, and the girl was left inside alone. Can you see her in there? Can you imagine being told that you have to spin the straw into gold by the next morning? How is that going to happen? There sat the poor miller's daughter, without the slightest idea how anyone could spin straw into gold. For the life of her, she did not know what to do. She grew more and more frightened, and then she began to weep. Suddenly, the door sprang open, and a tiny man stepped in. "Good evening, Mistress Miller," he said. "Why are you sobbing?" "Oh," the girl cried, "I must spin this straw into gold, and I don't know how." "What will you give me if I spin it for you?" the little man asked. "My necklace," answered the girl. The little man took her necklace and sat down at the spinning wheel. He pulled 3 times, whir, 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 and the spool was wound full of gold thread. He fitted another spool on, and whir, whir, whir. 3 pulls, and that one too was full. And so it went until morning, when all the straw was spun and all the spools were full of gold. When the king came at sunrise, he was amazed and delighted, but all that gold only made him greedier. So he led the miller's daughter to a larger room filled with straw, and he ordered her to spin this straw too before dawn, if she valued her life. That's a lot of straw. The girl did not know what to do. She began to weep. Once more, the door opened, and the little man stepped in. "What will you give me if I spin this straw into gold for you?" he asked. "The ring on my finger," answered the girl, and the little man took her ring. Then he set the spinning wheel whirring, and before the night was over, he had spun all the straw into gleaming gold. Shortly after sunrise, the king returned. Piles of golden spools glowed in the morning light. The king rejoiced at the sight of so much gold, but still he was not satisfied. He led the miller's daughter to a third, even bigger room that was piled high with straw. "Tonight you must spin this straw too," ordered the king, "and if you succeed, you shall become my wife." Because, he thought, I could not find a richer wife in all the world. When the king had left, the little man appeared for the third time. "What will you give me if I spin for you yet once more?" he asked. "I have nothing else," the girl replied. "Then promise that when you become queen, your first child will belong to me." The miller's daughter gasped. How could she promise such a thing? Then she thought, but who knows whether that will ever happen? And as she could think of no other way to save herself, she promised, and the little man once again spun all the straw into gold. When the king came in the morning and found everything as he wished, he married the miller's beautiful daughter, and she became queen. A year passed, and the queen brought a handsome baby boy into the world. She gave scarcely a thought to the little man, but one day he appeared suddenly in her room. "Now give me what you promised me," he demanded. The queen pleaded with the little man. He could take all the royal treasure if he would only let her keep her child. But her pleading was in vain. Then she began to weep so piteously that at last the little man was moved. "I will give you 3 days," he said. "If by the end of that time you know my name, you may keep your child." Long into the night the queen sat and thought, and through the next day, thinking over all the names she had ever heard. That evening the little man returned. Beginning with Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, the queen recited every name she knew, one after another. But to each one the little man replied, "That is not my name." The second day the queen had inquiries made in town, searching for new names, and when the little man came that evening, she posed the strangest and most unusual ones to him. She tried Beastie Ribs and Lego Ram and String Bones, but he would only reply, "That is not my name." Now the queen grew truly frightened, and she sent her most faithful servant into the woods to look for the little man. The servant searched through thickets and over clearings deep into the forest. At last, near the top of a high hill, she spied him. Do you see him? He was riding on a cooking spoon around a great fire and crying out, "I brew my beer, I bake my loaves, and soon the queen's own son I'll claim. Oh, lucky me, for no one knows that Rumpelstiltskin is my name." The servant made her way back as fast as she could manage, and at midday reached the castle. You can imagine how glad the queen was when she heard the name. Late that evening, the little man arrived. "Now, Mrs. Queen," he said, "do you know my name, or do I take the child?" So the queen asked him, "Is your name Will?" "No." "Is your name Phil?" "No." "In that case, is your name Rumpelstiltskin?" "The devil told you that! The devil told you that!" shrieked Rumpelstiltskin, and in a fury he jumped on his cooking spoon and flew out the window. And he was never heard from again. The end. Happy ending. She was able to keep her baby, and Rumpelstiltskin is gone forever. I hope you enjoyed that story, boys and girls, and I hope that you are able to pick out some elements that you heard in this fairy tale, and we'll talk about them the next time we see each other. I hope that you'll find some fairy tales that you would like to read, boys and girls. There's so many out there, and we can talk about them later. Have a great day. Bye-bye.